Barron Trump, the towering son of a former president, stood outside a luxurious Manhattan restaurant when something astonishing happened. Something so incredible, so jaw-dropping, it would become the greatest story of kindness ever told. A shivering, broken woman, hidden in the icy shadows of New York's wealthiest streets, dared to approach him. Her name was Sarah Jones, and her life had crumbled into a nightmare she never saw coming. What unfolded next wasn't just a fleeting moment of charity. It was a chain reaction of hope so powerful it would ripple across the nation, leaving teachers everywhere in awe and her harshest critics sobbing in defeat. The wind howled through Manhattan's towering skyscrapers that cold November evening, cutting through Sarah's thin jacket like a knife. Her stomach roared with hunger, a sound so loud it startled a passing businesswoman, who shot her a wide-eyed glance before rushing off in her clicking heels. 2 days had passed since Sarah's last bite of food, a measly half sandwich tossed her way by a sympathetic deli owner. Once she'd been a respected third-grade teacher at PS 183, standing proudly before a classroom of eager faces. Now she was a ghost, shuffling through the city's unforgiving streets, her only keepsake a smooth, lucky stone tucked in her pocket, a gift from a student who believed it could change her fate. 8 months earlier, Sarah's world had been different. She taught multiplication tables, read poetry to bright-eyed kids, and smiled at little Maria, who always sat in the front row with her purple butterfly pencil case. For 15 years, teaching had been her life, her purpose. Then came the doctor's visit, a routine checkup that spiraled into a diagnosis, endless tests, and a surgery she thought her insurance would cover. She'd been wrong. The bills piled up, first in thousands, then tens of thousands, until the insurance company slammed the door shut, claiming a pre-existing condition they refused to honor. Her savings vanished. Her apartment slipped away. The school where she'd poured her heart couldn't keep her when she couldn't even get out of bed. Now Sarah trudged past a dazzling shop window, its Christmas lights mocking her reflection, a woman she barely recognized. Her brown hair, once neatly styled, hung limp and greasy. Her coat, a faded hand-me-down from a church bin, flapped uselessly against the wind. Her shoes, riddled with holes, let the cold seep into her bones. A gruff security guard barked at her to keep moving, no loitering allowed. She nodded, her head low, and shuffled on. The shelters were overflowing that time of year, and the ones with space felt unsafe. Last week, someone had snatched her backpack while she slept, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the treasures in her pockets. Memories haunted her like a relentless film reel. She saw the day she sold her car, the final eviction notice taped to her door, the pity in her principal's eyes when she resigned. Each sting was sharper than the wind slicing through her. Ahead, a warm glow spilled from Mario's, an upscale Italian restaurant where the rich dined on pasta that cost more than Sarah once earned in a day. The scent of garlic and fresh bread drifted out, twisting her empty stomach into knots. She clutched the lucky stone, its smooth surface a lifeline, and felt the folded, laminated photo beside it. A snapshot of her last class, their smiling faces preserved from a time when she still had a purpose. Night deepened and the temperature plummeted. Sarah knew she needed shelter soon, but hunger clouded her mind. She tried the usual spots, the library's back wall, the heating vents near office towers, but those were crowded now, claimed by others desperate to survive the winter. Tourists brushed past, chattering about their dinner plans, their voices a cruel reminder of what she'd lost. She couldn't block it out, couldn't stop picturing the last parent-teacher night at her school. The air had been thick with the aroma of homemade empanadas, dumplings, and Tommy's dad's famous chocolate chip cookies. Her classroom had felt alive then, a haven of warmth and laughter. A sleek black SUV rolled up to Mario's curb, snapping her from her reverie. A tall teenage boy stepped out, his wool coat screaming wealth, flanked by men in dark suits who scanned the street with hawk-like precision. Something about him stood out. He had a kind face, young but wise beyond his years. He smiled at his driver, a small gesture of gratitude that caught Sarah off guard. Not everyone with money bothered with kindness. Her legs trembled from cold and exhaustion, her breath fogging in the air. She shouldn't ask. She knew it was pointless, humiliating even. But that smile, it sparked a flicker of courage she hadn't felt in months. Sarah took a shaky step toward the restaurant's entrance. The security men zeroed in on her instantly, their hands twitching toward their earpieces. She nearly retreated, nearly melted back into the darkness where she'd learned to hide. But her stomach growled again, a desperate plea, and she thought of her students, how she taught them to be brave, to ask for help when they needed it. The boy was almost inside now, his hand brushing the door. In seconds, he'd vanish into that golden world of warmth and plenty. It was now or never. The lucky stone seemed to pulse in her pocket, urging her forward. Little Maria's voice echoed in her mind. "You always tell us to be brave, Miss Jones. That's why I gave you my lucky stone." Sarah's heart pounded as she opened her mouth, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. She called out, a soft, trembling plea for help, unsure if it would change her life or end in crushing rejection. Sarah's faint cry hung in the air outside Mario's, a fragile thread of hope against the roar of the city. The tall boy paused, his hand on the restaurant door, and turned. Streetlights illuminated his face, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Recognition hit her like a punch. She'd seen those features before, plastered across TV screens and magazine covers back when she could still afford a grocery store trip. It was Barron Trump, the former president's son, standing mere feet away. Of all the people in Manhattan's glittering chaos, she'd stumbled into the path of a figure whose every move sparked headlines. Her courage faltered, crumbling like the stale bread she hadn't tasted in days. The security team sprang into action, their faces hard as stone. One barked at her to step back, his voice sharp and commanding. Another positioned himself between her and Barron, a wall of black-suited muscle. Through the gap, she caught Barron watching her, his eyes curious, not cruel. Sarah's feet felt glued to the pavement, her mind racing. She wasn't just a nobody now, she was a nobody daring to interrupt someone untouchable. More guards appeared, their SUVs gliding silently to the curb like predators circling prey. She should run, vanish into the night before this became a scene, before they hauled her away. But then Barron spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a quiet thunderclap. He told his team to wait, a simple command that froze them in their tracks. Sarah clutched the lucky stone so hard it dug into her palm, her pulse hammering. He studied her, his gaze steady, almost searching. She hadn't realized how badly she was shaking until he pointed it out, his tone soft but sure. The wind whipped harder, slicing through her ragged jacket, and she saw one guard shift, his hand brushing his earpiece again, probably itching to end this. The restaurant door swung open, spilling warm air laced with the scent of garlic bread and marinara. Sarah's stomach twisted so fiercely she nearly buckled. Inside, people dined at white-clothed tables, their plates heaped with food she could only dream of. Barron glanced back at the golden glow, then at her. His expression shifted, something clicked, a decision made. He stepped toward her, ignoring the guard's warning hiss. The air grew thick with possibility, heavy with the weight of what might happen next. To her shock, he asked her name. The question was so ordinary, so human, it nearly broke her. When was the last time anyone cared enough to ask? Not the shelter workers scribbling on forms, not the cops shooing her from doorways, not the strangers who looked through her every day. Tears stung her eyes as she whispered, "Sarah Jones." He nodded, like her name mattered, and then did something unthinkable. He invited her inside. The news van creeping around the corner barely registered as he gestured toward Mario's, his voice calm but firm, promising warmth and a chance to talk away from prying eyes. Sarah hesitated, caught in a surreal haze. The security team moved like a well-oiled machine, one opening the door while others blocked the street's view. She stepped into Mario's, the heat hitting her like a tidal wave. The aroma of fresh bread and herbs overwhelmed her senses, making her dizzy. Rich diners glanced up, their faces twisting with surprise and disdain at her shabby figure. A waiter rushed over, likely to eject her, but froze when he recognized Barron. The shift was instant. His tone turned silky, offering Barron's usual table, a private room. Barron requested an extra place setting and Sarah's heart skipped. This couldn't be real. The thick carpet swallowed her worn shoes as they crossed the restaurant. The soft lighting and murmur of wealthy chatter felt like a dream after months on the streets. She gripped the lucky stone, its solid weight grounding her in this alien world. The private room was small, elegant, a single table by a window overlooking a tiny garden. 2 guards stationed outside, one lingered in the corner, silent as a shadow. Barron pulled out a chair for her, a gesture so polite it brought fresh tears to her eyes. When had anyone last treated her like a person, not a problem? She sat, catching her reflection in the glass, hollow cheeks, tangled hair, a coat that screamed desperation. She didn't belong here. Any second, someone would wake up and toss her out. Barron poured water from a crystal pitcher, asking if she'd like some, as if she were a guest, not an intruder. The waiter swept in with a basket of steaming garlic bread, its scent so divine her stomach roared loud enough to echo. She flushed, mortified, but Barron just smiled and slid the basket closer, urging her to eat. Her hands shook as she tore into the bread, trying to pace herself, to cling to dignity. He busied himself with the menu, giving her space, though she devoured 3 pieces in a frantic blur. Outside, the news van parked, its camera operator filming the restaurant's facade. The security team had it handled, no clear shot of the drama unfolding within. Sarah slowed, the bread settling her hunger just enough to think. Barron looked at her then, his voice gentle but direct. He'd noticed how she carried herself, the laminated photo peeking from her pocket, a class picture, he guessed. Teachers laminated things. She nodded, stunned by his perception. 3rd grade, she said, at PS 183 until everything fell apart. He waited patient as she spilled her story. The diagnosis, the bills, the insurance betrayal, the slide into homelessness. When she finished, silence stretched between them. Camera flashes sparked outside as reporters gathered, but inside this warm bubble of garlic and possibility, time slowed. Barron reached for his phone, his face set with purpose. He wanted to make a call, he said, but first he had a question. Did she still want to teach? The words hit her like lightning. Teaching, Maria's grin over fractions, Tommy's pride at mastering a poem. It was all she'd ever wanted. More than anything, she breathed. Barron nodded as if he'd known her answer all along. Before he could dial, the door burst open. A young guard, flushed and urgent, warned of the growing press mob outside. Someone had tipped them off. Sarah's heart sank. This fairy tale was over. She braced to fade back into the shadows, but Barron's next move would rewrite her fate entirely. The private room in Mario's pulsed with tension as the young security guard, Mike, pleaded with Barron to leave. The press swarmed outside, their lights flashing like a storm, hungry for a scandal. Sarah's chest tightened. She'd been foolish to think this could last. She rose, ready to slip away, to become invisible again. But Barron's voice stopped her, steady and unshaken. He told her to sit, assuring Mike they weren't done. The guard hesitated, flustered by a call from Barron's father's office demanding answers about the chaos. Barron brushed it off, promising to handle it himself, his focus locked on Sarah. The garden beyond the window glowed with camera flashes, a frenzy building as more news vans rolled in. Sarah watched, mesmerized, until Barron's question pulled her back. Did she know Mrs. Chen from PS 183? The name jolted her. Alina Chen, the math specialist who turned multiplication into magic for her students. Sarah smiled, recalling how they'd collaborated, how Mrs. Chen believed every child could learn with the right push. Barron's eyes lit up. Mrs. Chen had tutored him too, he said, transforming his struggle with algebra into confidence. She'd retired last year, he added, her husband's illness and medical bills forcing her out, a mirror to Sarah's own ruin. Barron reached for his phone again, but Mike protested, his nerves fraying. Barron silenced him with a raised hand, demanding 5 minutes. The guard retreated, the door clicking shut. Sarah's breath caught as Barron's tone grew serious. He'd been working on something, he said, a project sparked by Mrs. Chen's plight. It had made him see the cracks in a system that crushed good people. He turned his phone toward her, revealing a website, Second Chances Education Initiative. Photos of teachers scrolled past, their stories echoing hers: medical crises, lost jobs, despair. Then came the triumphs: classrooms reclaimed, lives rebuilt, hope restored. Mrs. Chen was the program director now, Barron explained, her smile beaming from a photo beside a whiteboard of equations. They offered full medical coverage, housing, everything a teacher needed to rise again. Sarah's tears blurred the screen. Why teachers, she asked. Because they changed lives, he said simply. Mrs. Chen had changed his. Sarah had changed countless others. He believed she could still do more. The guard knocked again, sharper this time, but Barron pressed on. Would she join them, be their next success story? Sarah's fingers brushed the lucky stone, its warmth a quiet promise. Doubt gnawed at her. The press would twist this, make it a circus, shame him for helping someone like her. Barron grinned, undeterred. He was counting on it, he said. Real change needed witnesses. He stood, smoothing his coat, ready to face the cameras. Today she'd look broken, he said, but tomorrow would be different. Today was the spark, the beginning of something massive. Before Sarah could answer, the door swung open. Not Mike this time, but Mrs. Chen herself, elegant in a blue suit, her silver-streaked hair catching the light. Sarah's legs buckled, but Barron steadied her. Mrs. Chen rushed forward, taking her other hand, her voice warm with recognition. She suspected it was Sarah when Barron described a homeless teacher from PS 183. They'd been searching for her, she said. The staff, the students, even little Maria, who still asked about her. Sarah's hand flew to the lucky stone as Mrs. Chen smiled. Maria had told her about giving it to her favorite teacher, proud it might help. The cameras outside buzzed louder, a growing roar of excitement. Barron stepped in, calm but firm. The press would tell this story, he said, one way or another. They could shape it, show the world why this mattered, or let the vultures spin their lies. Mrs. Chen squeezed her hand, echoing Sarah's old lessons about bravery, about facing challenges head-on. Sarah looked between them, Barron, the unlikely savior, and Mrs. Chen, her long-lost colleague, offering a lifeline she'd never dared imagine. What would she have to do? Just tell her story, Barron said, expose how a dedicated teacher could fall so far over one medical disaster. Then let them help her reclaim her place in a classroom. Mrs. Chen chimed in, her eyes twinkling. PS 183 needed a third-grade teacher next semester, once Sarah was ready. Her heart soared. Her old school, her old grade, could it be real? Mike poked his head in again, frantic about the press and another call from Barron's father. Barron left it to Sarah. The help was hers, cameras or not. She touched the lucky stone one last time, then squared her shoulders like she used to before a new class. Let's do it, she said, her voice steady. Let's show them what change looks like. Mrs. Chen beamed, Barron nodded, and they moved as one toward the door. Sarah held their hands, anchors against the storm ahead. They stepped outside and the world erupted. Camera flashes blinded her, but Barron and Mrs. Chen flanked her, unwavering. The security team held the line, giving the press just enough to see. Questions flew like arrows. Why was Barron helping a homeless woman? Was this a stunt? What was Mrs. Chen's role? Sarah's knees shook, but she remembered her classroom, the nervous thrill of a new lesson. This was her moment to teach again, in a way she'd never expected. Barron spoke first, his voice ringing clear, ready to turn this desperate plea into a victory that would silence her doubters and shake the nation to its core. The air outside Mario's crackled with raw energy as Sarah Jones stepped into a blinding storm of camera flashes, Barron, Trump, and Mrs. Chen standing tall beside her like unshakable pillars. The reporters surged forward, a chaotic sea of microphones and shouted questions, their voices clawing at the night. The security team held a fragile line, letting just enough of the scene peek through to feed the frenzy. Sarah's heart thundered, her worn shoes pressing into the cold pavement, but she clung to the warmth of Barron's and Mrs. Chen's hands. This wasn't just a moment, it was a battlefield, and Barron was about to unleash a truth so explosive it would tear down every critic who'd ever sneered at people like her. The crowd hushed as Barron raised a hand, his towering frame cutting through the noise like a blade. He began to speak, his voice steady, slicing through the chaos with a quiet power that demanded attention. He painted a picture of two teachers who'd shaped his life, one who taught him math could be conquered, another who'd shown him kindness was a strength. Mrs. Chen stood as living proof of the first, her wisdom now fueling a mission to save others. The second, he said, was a memory from his childhood, a third-grade teacher whose gentle lessons lingered in his soul. He turned the spotlight on Sarah then, her ragged coat and hollow cheeks a stark contrast to his polished wool, and the reporters leaned in, pencils hovering, cameras rolling. Sarah felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, but Barron's words lifted her. He told her story, not as a sob tale, but as a blazing indictment of a system that chewed up good people and spat them out. She'd been a teacher, he said, a woman who'd spent 15 years lighting up young minds, only to be crushed by medical bills and an insurance company's cold betrayal. 8 months ago, she'd stood in a classroom at PS 183, guiding kids through fractions and poetry. Now she stood here, hungry and forgotten, until this very night. The reporters scribbled furiously, some nodding as if their own buried memories of favorite teachers flickered to life. He unveiled the Second Chances Education Initiative, a lifeline born from Mrs. Chen's own brush with ruin. It wasn't just a program, it was a revolution, a roaring promise to haul teachers back from the brink with medical care, housing, and a path back to their classrooms. Sarah was its newest soldier, he declared, the living proof that hope could claw its way out of despair. The camera's word, capturing her every tremble, but she straightened her spine, channeling the teacher she'd once been, the one who could hush a rowdy room with a single look. She found her voice, raw but clear, and told the world her name. Sarah Jones, she said, once a third-grade teacher at PS 183, where she'd watched kids bloom under her care. She spoke of multiplication tables and the magic of a child's first poem, of faces like Maria's lighting up with understanding. Then came the sickness, the bills, the insurance company's knife in her back. She lost her job, her home, her dignity, everything but the lucky stone in her pocket, a gift from a student who believed in her. Tonight, she said, she'd learned a lesson she'd always taught. Asking for help wasn't weakness, it was the bravest thing of all. Her words hung in the air, simple but piercing, and the reporters' questions shifted, softer now, hungry for more. Would she teach again? How many had this program saved? What drove Barron to champion teachers? He fielded some, passing others to Mrs. Chen, who detailed the initiative's victories with the precision of a math whiz, dozens of teachers back in classrooms, hundreds more on the horizon. Sarah watched the crowd, seeing not just skepticism but glimmers of hope in their eyes. This wasn't a cheap publicity grab. It was real, raw, undeniable. A young reporter piped up, asking what she'd tell struggling teachers. Sarah paused, her mind flashing to her students' faces, then spoke from her core. It's not about falling, it's about rising with help from those who refuse to let you stay down. Barron seized the moment, dropping a bombshell that sent the cameras into overdrive. The Second Chances Initiative was expanding, 5 more cities by year's end, fueled by donors who saw its fire. The announcement ignited a fresh wave of questions, but something across the street stole Sarah's breath. Mrs. Chen nudged her to look. A small cluster of familiar faces stood on the sidewalk, watching her. Teachers from PS 183, parents, kids she'd taught, Maria bouncing with glee, Tommy taller now, his dad clutching a box that smelled suspiciously like chocolate chip cookies. They'd come the instant they heard, Mrs. Chen whispered, the whole school scouring the city for her all these months. Tears stung Sarah's eyes, not of shame but of belonging. Barron noticed, weaving it into his tale. This, he said, was the heart of it all: community, a refusal to let good teachers stand alone. Maria broke free then, darting through the crowd before anyone could blink, her arms wrapping around Sarah's waist. She crowed that the lucky stone had worked, just as she'd known it would. The cameras went wild, lenses drinking in the reunion, but Sarah barely saw them. She hugged Maria back, the stone warm against her palm, and realized this was bigger than a meal or a program. It was proof that even the invisible could be found. Barron and Mrs. Chen stepped aside, letting her soak in the moment, but she pulled them close, their hands joining hers in a circle of strength. The reporters kept filming, the story morphing from a fleeting headline into something epic. Later, as the crowd thinned and the vans peeled away, Sarah sat in the Second Chance's office, a cozy space with classroom vibes, motivational posters, and a whiteboard splashed with color. Mrs. Chen handed her jasmine tea, the same kind she'd sipped in her teaching days, and Barron perched in a student-sized chair, looking oddly at home. They had more to tell her, they said, a secret that would tie this night into a tapestry of fate she'd never imagined. The Second Chance's office wrapped Sarah in a familiar embrace, its walls plastered with posters about courage and growth, its whiteboard a riot of marker scribbles, its air tinged with the faint chalk dust scent of a classroom. She cradled the steaming jasmine tea, its warmth seeping into her hands, a taste that tugged her back to brighter days at PS 183. Mrs. Chen settled across from her, her silver-streaked hair glinting under the soft lights, while Barron leaned forward, his lanky frame folding into a chair meant for kids. They exchanged a glance, a silent signal that something monumental was coming, something that would stitch this crazy night into a legacy spanning decades. Barron began, his voice low but charged with purpose. This wasn't just chance, he said, not her stumbling into him outside Mario's, not this moment now. There was more, a deeper thread tying them all together. He pulled out his phone, swiping to a photo that made Sarah's breath hitch. She nearly dropped her tea as the image filled the screen, a younger Mrs. Chen, standing in a classroom beside another woman, one Sarah knew in her bones. Mrs. Patterson, her third-grade teacher-turned-mentor, stared back at her, frozen in time. Her laugh, her knack for making every kid feel seen, flooded Sarah's memory like a tidal wave. Mrs. Chen pointed to the back of the photo, urging Sarah to look closer. Her trembling fingers zoomed in, and there she was, a younger Sarah, wide-eyed and nervous on her first day of student teaching. She'd been terrified, clutching lesson plans like a lifeline, but Mrs. Patterson had guided her, taught her how to turn fear into strength. Barron's voice broke through her daze. Mrs. Patterson hadn't just been his third-grade teacher. She'd mentored Sarah too, years later. And Mrs. Chen, his algebra savior, had been Sarah's colleague, their paths crossing in quiet, fateful ways. 6 months ago, Barron said, he described his old teacher to Mrs. Chen, sparking a memory. She connected the dots, Mrs. Patterson's student teacher, a woman who'd vanished into the city's underbelly after a medical catastrophe. They'd hunted for her ever since, driven by guilt and a vow to fix what had broken. The Second Chance's initiative had already been simmering, but Sarah's story, Mrs. Patterson's protege lost to the streets, lit a fire under it. They'd launched sooner, dreamed bigger because of her. Mrs. Patterson's shadow loomed large, her death from cancer last year a wound that still bled. Before she passed, she'd made Barron promise to fight for teachers, to lift them up as they'd lifted others. Sarah's throat tightened. Mrs. Patterson's classroom had been a haven, bright with hope, alive with her quirky sayings. She'd handed out lucky stones to struggling kids, telling them luck wasn't magic, it was grit, courage to keep going. Mrs. Chen smiled, her eyes glinting with tears. She learned that trick from Mrs. Patterson too, passing it to Maria, who'd given Sarah her own stone. It was a chain of kindness, a relay of bravery stretching across generations, linking them all in ways Sarah hadn't seen until now. She pulled the stone from her pocket, its gray surface striped with white, glowing in the office light like a tiny beacon. Barron leaned in, his voice soft but fierce. Teaching was a ripple, he said. You never knew how far it spread. Mrs. Patterson's kindness had shaped him, her lessons had molded Sarah, and Sarah's courage had touched Maria, who'd unknowingly closed the circle with that stone. Mrs. Chen had pieced it together, and now Sarah would carry it forward, showing teachers everywhere that second chances weren't just dreams. They were real, tangible, hers for the taking. The circle wasn't closing, Mrs. Chen added. It was growing, a living thing fed by every life they touched. Sarah traced the stone's stripe, her mind spinning. Mrs. Patterson used to say teaching was planting seeds. Some you'd see bloom, some you'd trust to grow in shadows. She'd been right. Those seeds had sprouted into this program, into the teachers they'd saved, into the kids they'd teach tomorrow. Barron grinned, pointing out how her story had already sparked change, donors pouring in, cities clamoring to join. Mrs. Chen chimed in, her voice warm with pride. Sarah would teach again, she said, her classroom waiting like a home she'd never truly left. The tea cooled in Sarah's hands as she sat there, surrounded by echoes of her past and promises of her future. The posters urged her to dream big, the whiteboard begged for new lessons, and these two, Barron and Mrs. Chen, watched her with a faith she hadn't felt in months. She held the stone tighter, its warmth a quiet vow. Mrs. Patterson's seeds weren't just blooming. They were a forest now, sprawling and wild, ready to shelter anyone who'd fallen. Sarah's tears fell, not from loss but from the staggering truth. Her lowest moment had ignited something unstoppable, a legacy she'd carry back to the classroom and beyond. 6 weeks later, Sarah Jones stood outside room 302 at PS 183, her hand resting on the doorknob, her pulse racing with a mix of nerves and joy. Through the window, she saw her new third graders settling into their desks, 30 fresh faces, their chatter a muffled hum of excitement. She wore a crisp blue dress, picked out with Mrs. Chen's eagle eye, her hair neatly pinned, her shoes sturdy and new, built for a teacher who'd be on her feet all day. In her pocket sat 2 treasures, Maria's original lucky stone, smooth and steady, and a small box of 30 new stones, one for each child, ready to spark their own courage. This wasn't just a return, it was a rebirth, a triumph so massive it would bury her critics in a landslide of awe and tears. Barron appeared in the hallway, his tall frame a touch awkward among the kid-sized lockers and crayon-drawn posters. His smile was warm, genuine, cutting through her jitters. She teased him about skipping college to be here, but he waved it off, miss her first day back. Never. He nodded toward the classroom window and Sarah peeked inside, gasping. Mrs. Chen sat in the back, her silver hair catching the light, beaming like a proud parent. Beside her bounced Maria, who'd begged to witness this moment, her old teacher's grand comeback. Even Tommy, now a lanky middle schooler, had swung by, leaving a box of his dad's chocolate chip cookies on her desk, a sweet echo of her past. The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind, a blur of miracles stitched together by the Second Chances initiative. They delivered everything they'd promised: temporary housing in a cozy apartment, medical care to mend her broken body, and red tape wizards who'd reinstated her teaching credentials in record time. But it was more than logistics, it was purpose, a fire rekindled in her soul. Sarah had spoken at 3 teacher conferences already, her voice ringing out to packed rooms, sharing her fall and rise. She helped pinpoint other educators drowning in debt or despair, each rescue fueling the program's wildfire growth. Schools nationwide clamored to join, inspired by a story that had started with a desperate plea outside Mario's. Barron's voice pulled her from her thoughts. The morning news had run a follow-up, he said, her face flashing across screens from coast to coast. It wasn't just fluff. It had jolted 6 more states into probing teacher healthcare reform, a seismic shift Mrs. Patterson would have cheered from the heavens. Sarah touched the lucky stone, its weight a quiet tribute. Mrs. Patterson always said one teacher could change the world, Barron added, correcting her with a grin. It wasn't just anyone, but one teacher, a truth Sarah now embodied. The school bell rang, sharp and bright, startling them both. Inside, the kids scrambled to their seats, eyes glued to the door, waiting for her. Sarah's hand hovered on the knob, her breath steadying. Barron called her Miss Jones, thanking her, not for surviving, but for being brave enough to ask that night, for showing others they could too. She turned it back on him, thanking him for listening when no one else had. She pushed the door open, stepping into a flood of chalk dust and pencil shavings, scents that wrapped her in a homecoming hug. Happy tears pricked her eyes as Mrs. Chen waved from the back, Maria practically vibrating with glee. She faced her class, her teacher voice rising strong and clear. ready to tell them a story of bravery, kindness, and lucky stones. The kids leaned forward as she pulled the box from her pocket, lifting a stone to catch the light. She began, weaving a tale of a woman who'd lost everything, home, health, hope, until one freezing night when she dared to ask for help outside a fancy restaurant. A kind stranger listened, she said, and that small act rippled into something huge, bringing her back to this very room. A boy in the front row shot up his hand, asking if it was true she'd been homeless. Yes, she said simply, and that was their first lesson, not math or spelling, but how one spark of kindness could rewrite a life. She glanced at Maria, clutching her own stone, and Mrs. Chen, who tied this all together. Through the window, she caught Barron slipping away, already on his phone, likely rallying help for the next teacher in line. Mrs. Patterson's seeds weren't just growing. They were a sprawling garden now, roots sinking deep, branches reaching wide. Sarah passed out the stones, one by one, telling each child they held luck, not the fairy tale kind, but the kind you made by being brave, by lifting others when they stumbled. The kids clutched them, eyes wide, hanging on her every word. Weeks turned to months, and Sarah's classroom became a beacon. Her story spread through newsreels, viral posts, whispered tales in staff rooms, fueling the Second Chances initiative into a national force. Teachers she'd never met wrote to her, their letters brimming with gratitude, their lives patched back together by the program she'd helped ignite. Barron popped in sometimes, always with a sheepish grin, updating her on expansions. 10 cities now, then 20, with donors piling in like never before. Mrs. Chen took her to conferences, the two of them a dynamic duo, their talks leaving audiences in stunned, teary silence. One spring day, Maria raced into room 302 after school, her middle school backpack bouncing, and thrust a drawing into Sarah's hands. A crayon sketch of a teacher handing out stones, a tall boy and a silver-haired woman at her side, a crowd cheering behind them. "It's us," Maria said, her voice bubbling with pride, the Lucky Stone team. Sarah pinned it to her bulletin board, right next to Mrs. Patterson's old saying, scrawled in her looping hand, "Teaching is planting seeds, trust they'll bloom." They had, in ways Sarah couldn't have dreamed, that cold November night. Her critics, the ones who'd scoffed at her ragged plea, who'd branded Barron's kindness a stunt, fell silent, their smug doubts drowned by a tide of proof. The nation watched, riveted, as Sarah's classroom thrived, as teachers rose from ashes, as kids clutched lucky stones and learned what courage meant. She begged for scraps and sparked a movement, humiliating every naysayer with a comeback so glorious it echoed in every heart it touched. Standing before her class, stone in hand, Sarah smiled, knowing this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a chain that would stretch far beyond her, blooming forever. If you enjoyed this story, check out another video with an even more amazing tale. There's always something exciting waiting for you on our channel. And don't forget, more wonderful stories are coming soon. Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our upcoming adventures.